I need to tell you about the moment my life split in two. The before, when I still believed the world could be mapped and catalogued and understood, and the after, when I learned that some truths live in the spaces between certainty and madness. My name doesn't matter anymore, not the one that used to appear in academic journals before it became synonymous with professional suicide. What matters is that I came to these mountains broken, desperate for silence, running from the ruins of a career I'd spent 20 years building and destroyed in a single conference presentation. The university asked for my resignation, with that particular brand of institutional gentleness that feels like a knife wrapped in velvet. My theories about convergent evolution in canid species were called irresponsible speculation, my research methods questionable at best, my conclusions dangerous pseudoscience masquerading as legitimate inquiry. They were right to be afraid, though not for the reasons they thought. I packed what remained of my reputation into a decade-old Jeep and drove 17 hours into the Appalachian wilderness, to the place my grandfather used to call the old country, where the mountains remember things that cities have forgotten. The research station was exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, a weathered cabin perched on a ridge like a shipwreck on a green ocean, surrounded by forests so thick it seemed to swallow sound itself. The silence up here isn't peaceful, it's watchful, pregnant with the kind of attention that makes your skin prickle, even when you can't see what's looking. I told myself I came for redemption, for the chance to work in obscurity until I could rebuild some fragment of credibility. I told myself the isolation was temporary, that I'd spend a few months reviewing data, writing careful papers with conservative conclusions, becoming small and acceptable again. But that's not why I came, not really. I came because of something my grandfather said to me 3 days before he died, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength, his eyes sharp despite the morphine. "The old walkers are still up there, boy," he whispered, and I'd smiled sadly, thinking it was delirium, the confused rambling of a mind slipping away. "You've got the sight in your blood, same as me. When you're ready, when you've lost everything else, go back to the mountain, they'll be waiting." I dismissed it as fever dreams, the folklore he'd collected, becoming tangled with his fading consciousness. Now, unpacking boxes of discredited research in a cabin that smells of old wood and older secrets, I found myself wondering what he'd really meant. The last box I opened contained his field journals, dozens of them, leather-bound and filled with his careful handwriting, hidden among my belongings, as if he'd known I'd eventually end up exactly here. The first week passed in a blur of routine, cataloging equipment, establishing baseline wildlife monitoring, falling into the rhythm of solitary research that had always been my refuge from the social complexities I'd never quite mastered. I hiked the fossil beds where Pleistocene deposits broke through the soil like broken teeth, places where ancient bones still surfaced after heavy rains, whispering stories of species that walked these ridges when the glaciers were retreating. The woods felt different than I remembered from childhood visits, deeper somehow, as if the spaces between the trees had expanded when I wasn't looking. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned my head, hear sounds that didn't quite match the wildlife I knew should be there. Something too large for a deer, too deliberate for a bear, moving parallel to my path but never revealing itself. At night, lying in my sleeping bag and listening to the cabin settle, I'd think about my grandfather's stories, the ones he'd tell around campfires about creatures that walked upright through the laurel thickets, intelligent eyes reflecting moonlight, watchers of the boundary places where wilderness and civilization met, children's tales, I'd always thought, folklore, to make the mysterious woods more romantic. But children's tales don't usually destroy careers, and folklore doesn't usually circle your cabin in the dark. The dismissal from tenure-track position had been the final collapse after months of professional hemorrhaging, colleagues who stopped returning emails, research partners who quietly removed Their names from joint publications, the gradual freezing out that academics deploy against those who violate unstated boundaries. I'd proposed that human evolution might have had more competition than we acknowledged, that our dominance wasn't inevitable, but contingent, that parallel intelligence might have developed in species we'd categorized as simple predators. The evidence was circumstantial, admittedly, patterns in the fossil record that suggested something anomalous, gaps that didn't quite make sense, indigenous accounts that persisted across centuries with suspicious consistency. They called it career suicide. I called it following the data wherever it led, even into uncomfortable territories. Now, exiled to these forgotten mountains with nothing left to lose, I had time to wonder if perhaps my mistake wasn't being wrong, but being right too publicly, too soon. The forest beyond my window rustled with presence I couldn't name, and somewhere in the darkness, something was walking that didn't belong in any textbook I'd ever read. The fossil beds revealed themselves after 3 days of cold rain, exposed strata bleeding from the hillside like geological wounds that refused to heal. I'd been mapping the site methodically, photographing layers that told stories of climate shifts and extinction events, when my brush uncovered something that made my hands stop moving. The bone fragment was small enough to fit in my palm, but dense, with a surface texture that felt wrong somehow, caught between familiar and impossible. I documented it carefully, my training overriding the strange electricity that crawled up my spine as I handled it. The cranial structure suggested canid ancestry, but the brain case was all wrong, too large, with suture patterns that indicated extended development. Intelligence that shouldn't exist in this evolutionary line. I spent hours cross-referencing it against every database I had, every comparative anatomy text, calling up images of wolf skulls and prehistoric dire wolves, and every extinct species that might explain what I was holding. Nothing matched. The bone didn't fit anywhere in the timeline I'd spent 2 decades studying, dated through the surrounding sediment to a period that made no sense. Caught between epochs like something that had slipped through a crack in evolutionary history itself. I found more fragments over the following days, excavating with the obsessive focus that had always marked my best and most dangerous work, ignoring the ache in my back and the way the light seemed to fade faster than it should in these particular hollows. Each discovery deepened the anomaly. Vertebrae that suggested full bipedal locomotion, metacarpals that showed evidence of tool manipulation, dental patterns that spoke of omnivorous adaptation and complex social behaviors. I laid them out on my cabin floor at night, arranging and rearranging them like pieces of a puzzle assembled from the wrong box, trying to make them conform to categories that kept refusing to hold them. The scientific part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation, contamination of the strata, displaced bones from different periods, somehow mixed through geological upheaval, my own confirmation bias, seeing patterns that didn't exist. But the deeper part, the instinct that had driven my controversial theories and ultimately destroyed my reputation, recognized what I was really looking at. Evidence of something that had evolved alongside human ancestors, parallel development in a species we'd never acknowledged existed, intelligence that had learned to hide itself so completely that modern science had written it off as myth. I thought about my grandfather's journals, still unread in the box by my bed, and felt a cold certainty settling into my chest like sediment drifting to the bottom of dark water. The local hunters found me on the 8th day, 2 men weathered by mountain seasons and carrying rifles with the casual familiarity of people who'd been born with them in their hands. They'd seen my jeep on the fire road, come to make sure I wasn't lost or in trouble, and stayed for coffee that turned into whiskey as the afternoon dimmed toward evening. They spoke carefully at first, sizing me up, trying to determine what category of outsider I represented, whether I was the kind who'd listen or the kind who'd laugh. Something about my face must have convinced them, or maybe it was the desperation they read in my eyes. The look of someone already halfway to believing impossible things. "There's something up on the high ridges," the older one finally said, his voice dropping to a register meant for confessions and warnings. "Been there longer than the Cherokee, longer than the mound builders, maybe longer than anything with a name. It watches. It moves through the laurel thickets without making a sound. The old-timers called it different things, but everyone who's spent real time in these mountains knows it's there." His companion nodded, adding details with reluctance. Stories of massive shapes crossing logging roads at dawn, tracks that appeared overnight in impossible places, a presence that hunters learned not to follow too deep into the hollows where the cell phones stopped working and the forest grew strange. I should have dismissed them the way I'd dismissed 100 similar stories during my academic career, folklore contaminated by expectation and fear, the human tendency to populate darkness with monsters rather than accept that some things simply remain unknown. Instead, I found myself sharing what I'd discovered in the fossil beds, describing the anomalous bones in clinical detail, watching their faces shift from caution to recognition to something that looked uncomfortably like relief. "So you found the proof," the older hunter said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "Your grandfather looked for years. Guess it runs in families, the need to know." They left before full dark with warnings I pretended to take less seriously than I did, about staying inside after midnight, about not following tracks if I found them, about understanding that some things allowed themselves to be seen only when they chose. That night I finally opened my grandfather's journals and read until dawn, my coffee going cold as his careful documentation revealed decades of systematic observation, sketches of prints and scat and territorial markings, notes on behavior patterns and seasonal movements, and underneath it all a growing certainty that he'd been studying not an animal, but a people, hidden and ancient and deserving of respect rather than exposure. The last entry was dated 3 weeks before his death. "They know about the boy. When he's ready, they'll make themselves known. Pray he's stronger than I was, carrying what cannot be shared." The tracks appeared on the 10th night, pressed deep into the soft earth. Round my cabin with a weight that suggested something far larger than any wolf or bear that might wander these ridges. I found them at first light, circling the perimeter in a pattern that felt too purposeful to dismiss as random animal movement, each print showing 5 distinct toes with claw marks that curved slightly inward, heel pads that spoke of bipedal weight distribution, a gait that measured distance with intelligence rather than instinct. I knelt beside the clearest impression, my fingers tracing the outline without touching, professional documentation warring with something more primitive rising in my chest, the ancestral recognition of being watched by something that understood exactly what it was doing. The prints led into the tree line and vanished where the ground turned to stone, but I could feel the trajectory continuing, a presence that had withdrawn just far enough to remain undefined, close enough to make its awareness known. I photographed everything with hands that wanted to shake, measuring stride, length and depth, comparing them against every reference I had for black bears standing upright, for elk, for the largest recorded wolves, finding nothing that matched the proportions or the deliberate arrangement. These weren't the tracks of an animal investigating human scent or searching for food. They were a perimeter inspection, territorial. Acknowledgement, perhaps even introduction, something letting me know it was aware of my presence here in its domain and had chosen for now to allow it. The circles continued each night for a week, and I began to recognize variations in the patterns, subtle changes in arrangement that suggested intentionality beyond mere territorial marking. Some mornings, the tracks formed concentric rings that reminded me of ripples in still water. Others, they created geometric shapes that made my skin prickle with recognition I couldn't quite name, alignments that seemed to reference the ridgelines visible from my porch or the position of certain stars I'd noticed particularly bright in the mountain. Darkness. I stayed awake later each evening, sitting on the cabin steps with my lantern extinguished, letting my eyes adjust to the quality of shadow that exists only in places where human light pollution has never reached, listening to the forest sounds that I was learning to pass into categories of ordinary and other. The wind moved through the canopy with voices that sometimes felt like language, and twice I heard something large moving through the understory with a silence that seemed to violate physics, displaced air, and broken twigs, somehow creating less sound than deer or wild pigs that crashed through the same terrain with obvious noise. I never saw anything clearly, just suggestions of movement at the edge of perception, a sense of being studied by intelligence that knew exactly how much to reveal, testing my reactions with the patience of something that understood time differently than humans do. My grandfather's journals had mentioned this phase, the gradual revelation, the way they allowed chosen individuals to become accustomed to their presence before any direct contact, vetting worthiness through observation. On the 14th night, I woke to absolute silence, the kind that registers as wrong before conscious thought can identify why, every cricket and tree frog and hunting owl suddenly absent from the soundscape that had become my evening companion. The darkness beyond my window felt solid somehow, weighted with attention, and I rose without deciding to, pulled by instinct, older than my scientific training, moving to the door and opening it to stand on the threshold between human shelter and the wild that pressed against it. The moon was 3 days from full, bright enough to cast shadows that looked cut from black paper, and in those shadows something stood at the tree line, massive and still, watching me with eyes that caught the moonlight and reflected it back in shades that shouldn't exist in nature. Amber shot through with gold, and something deeper, older, like looking into geological time, made conscious and aware. My breath, a caught in my chest, every muscle locked between the urge to flee and the more powerful imperative to remain still, to show respect rather than fear. And we held that position for what might have been seconds or minutes, time becoming as fluid as the shadows that half concealed its form. It was tall, taller than any man, with a posture that suggested both canine ancestry and something entirely its own. Shoulders too broad, head too large, proportions that spoke of evolutionary paths that had never appeared in any textbook because we'd convinced ourselves they couldn't exist. Then it moved, not running but simply withdrawing, fading into the forest with impossible silence. And I realized I was trembling not with terror, but with recognition so profound it felt like grief, like remembering something my blood had known all along, that my mind had been trained to deny. I spent the following day in a state of hyper-awareness that made ordinary tasks feel surreal, my hands going through the motions of preparing food and organizing field notes, while my consciousness remained fixed on those seconds of contact, replaying them over and over, trying to capture details that kept sliding away from clear memory, like water refusing to be grasped. The scientific part of my brain wanted measurements, taxonomic classification, evolutionary context, but something deeper understood that this required different categories entirely, a framework that honored mystery rather than dissecting it. I returned to the fossil beds and looked at the bone fragments with new eyes, seeing not specimens but family records, burial sites perhaps, or intentional caches left by a people who understood that evidence of their existence needed to be preserved somewhere, somehow, hidden in the earth that had sheltered them for millennia. That evening I gathered stones from the creek bed and arranged them in a careful pattern on the ground near the tree line, creating my own geometric response to the track formations, an offering of acknowledgement, proof that I was trying to learn the grammar of this older language. I left them there and returned to the cabin, feeling exposed and uncertain, wondering if I'd committed some terrible breach of protocol or taken a step toward communication that might change everything, knowing there was no map for this territory, no peer-reviewed methodology for making contact with something that existed in the spaces between human awareness and the wild places we'd convinced ourselves we'd fully conquered and catalogued and understood. The response came 3 nights later, not in the form I'd expected, but in a language I was beginning to recognize, written in the syntax of the wild itself. I discovered it at dawn when I walked to the creek to fill my water containers, finding the stones I'd arranged now incorporated into a larger pattern, expanded with additional rocks that created spirals leading outward from my simple geometric offering, each stone carefully selected for color and size, placed with such precision that the morning light caught them at angles that made the whole design seem to glow with intentional meaning. Around this central arrangement, pressed into the soft ground, were handprints, if they could be called that, larger than human, showing 5 digits with claw tips, marks that revealed a dexterity I hadn't expected, the careful placement of palms that spoke of consideration, of response rather, than reaction, and at the edge of the pattern, half hidden beneath a fallen branch, arranged too deliberately to be accidental, I found an offering that stopped my heart, a perfectly intact canid skull, ancient and fossilized, a specimen that would have been worth months of careful excavation, simply placed there like a gift, like a key to understanding, like evidence of trust extended across a divide I was only beginning to comprehend. I knelt there for nearly an hour, my water containers forgotten, understanding that I'd been answered, that some conversation had begun that transcended words entirely, communication flowing through symbol and gesture and the patient grammar of the earth itself. That evening I sat outside long after sunset, my back against the cabin wall, no lantern lit, letting the darkness become familiar rather than threatening, teaching myself to see with more than eyes, to sense with more than the limited perception my professional training had convinced me was sufficient. The forest sounds returned. Gradually, as if the woods needed to be sure of my intentions before allowing me back into its confidence, cricket songs resuming one by one, an owl calling from the ridge with questions that sounded almost like language, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible beneath the wind, something that might have been vocalization, low and resonant, not quite howl or growl, but some sound that existed in the space between, carrying information I couldn't translate but could feel in my chest like a second heartbeat. I closed my eyes and listened deeper, trying to quiet the analytical mind that wanted to categorize and explain, opening instead to the possibility that understanding might come through channels I'd been taught didn't exist, knowledge transmitted through presence and patience rather than data collection. When I opened my eyes again, the night had shifted somehow, the quality of darkness more permeable, and in the tree line I could make out shapes that might have been shadows, or might have been watchers, 3 or 4 of them spaced evenly across the visible forest edge, patient and still, observing me with what felt like curiosity rather than threat, as if I were being evaluated for something I couldn't yet name but knew was important beyond measure. The first direct encounter happened on a night when the moon rose late and the stars burned with unusual clarity, when the boundary between earth and sky seemed thinner somehow, more negotiable. I heard the approach this time, not because it was careless, but because it chose to be heard, footsteps that announced themselves through deliberate weight on dry leaves, a courtesy that told me I was being given warning, time to prepare. It emerged from the shadows, near the stone arrangement, and in the starlight I could see it fully for the first time, the reality of it so far beyond my expectations that language felt inadequate to contain the sight. Massive and upright, covered in fur that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, dark russet shading to silver along the spine, with a head that held both canine ancestry and something profoundly other, intelligence looking out from eyes that met mine with recognition that felt mutual, ancient, as if we'd known each other across lifetimes or species memory. It raised one hand, palm forward, fingers spread in a gesture that looked ceremonial, and without thinking I mirrored the movement, my Smaller human hand responding to an invitation I didn't consciously understand, but felt in my bones, acknowledgement passing between us, witness and witnessed, two evolutionary branches that had developed separately, yet somehow carried memory of common ground, of a time before the divergence when all intelligence was kin and the world was larger than human claiming could diminish. We stood there in silence that felt like conversation, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was choice, that these beings could remain hidden forever if they wished, that they possessed intelligence sophisticated enough to avoid every camera trap and research expedition and cryptozoological investigation that had ever sought proof of their existence. They revealed themselves only when they decided the risk was worthwhile, when they found individuals who might understand that documentation wasn't the same as desecration, that some knowledge carried responsibility heavier than academic recognition. The creature lowered its hand slowly, and I did the same, mirroring the gesture with reverence I usually reserved for handling the most delicate fossils, understanding that I was in the presence of something equally precious and infinitely more alive, a survivor of deep time that had chosen to step into visibility with me, entrusting me with awareness that could either protect or endanger everything it represented. Then it turned with fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and before melting back into the forest it paused, looking back once with an expression I would spend years trying to describe, something between hope and sorrow, invitation and warning, a gaze that told me this was only beginning, that I'd been accepted into an initiation whose full meaning I couldn't yet grasp, but had already transformed me irrevocably, marked me as someone who would carry knowledge that lived in the space between science and sacred, guardian of a truth that demanded silence and testimony in equal measure. The days following that first direct encounter passed in a fever of research that felt more like archaeology of consciousness than traditional science, digging not through sediment, but through layers of suppressed history, unearthing narratives that had been deliberately buried beneath the weight of colonial certainty and academic dismissal. I began with my grandfather's journals, reading them, now with new comprehension, understanding references I'd previously interpreted as metaphor or senility, his careful documentation of the old walkers revealing itself as meticulous field observation conducted across decades of patient contact. But I needed more, needed context that reached beyond one family's secret knowledge, and I found it in places the university libraries had relegated to footnotes and archives, in indigenous accounts that anthropologists had recorded but never truly heard, stories from Cherokee elders and Shawnee historians speaking of the Wolf brothers who walked upright, beings that existed before and alongside human settlement, respected as neighbors rather than feared as monsters. The pattern emerged slowly but undeniably, testimony spanning centuries and geographical boundaries, describing not random creature sightings, but evidence of a sustained parallel society, intelligent beings who had chosen concealment over conflict, who had watched human expansion with what the accounts described as ancient sorrow, witnessing from the margins as their territories shrank and their numbers dwindled, maintaining presence in the liminal spaces humans had learned not to see, surviving through adaptive intelligence that rivaled and perhaps exceeded our own. The revelation that shattered my remaining scientific framework came from a suppressed 1920s expedition report I discovered in a university basement, moldering in a box marked for disposal, pages written by a researcher whose name had been systematically removed from official records, his findings deemed too dangerous or too impossible to acknowledge. He'd excavated a site in the Cumberland Gap where indigenous burial Mounds stood adjacent to what he called parallel interment structures, finding remains that his analysis concluded represented two distinct intelligent species living in deliberate proximity, evidence of cultural exchange and possible cooperation dating back thousands of years before European contact. The bone morphology he described matched exactly what I'd been finding in my own fossil beds, skeletal structures that showed canid ancestry, but cranial capacities suggesting abstract thought, tool use, symbolic reasoning, hands capable of manipulation that went far beyond predatory necessity, evolutionary adaptations that had occurred along a completely separate trajectory from human development yet arrived at similar destinations through different paths. His conclusion, the one that had destroyed his career and condemned his work to archival oblivion, was that human beings were not the only species to achieve consciousness on this continent, that we had shared the landscape with evolutionary cousins who had simply chosen a different relationship with visibility, with dominance, with the very concept of civilization itself, beings who had looked at the fork in development where humanity chose agriculture and settlement and had consciously selected the path of sustainable wilderness integration instead, intelligence expressed through harmony rather than conquest. This understanding broke something fundamental in how I conceived my own species, my own place in the hierarchy of significance I'd been trained to accept as natural law, and I found myself sitting in my cabin at 3 in the morning, surrounded by documents and bone samples and photographs of the stone arrangements, weeping for reasons I couldn't fully articulate except to say I felt the weight of what we'd lost without ever knowing we'd had it, the companionship of other minds that might have taught us different ways of being intelligent, of being powerful, of being human in a world we didn't have to dominate to inhabit. The Dogmen weren't cryptids or anomalies or evolutionary mistakes. They were the road not taken, the choice to remain wild while developing wisdom, proof that consciousness didn't require cities or agriculture or the systematic transformation of Earth into resource, that intelligence could express itself through integration rather than separation, through watching and listening rather than claiming and naming, and we had driven them to the edge of extinction, not through deliberate genocide, but through something perhaps worse, through the casual blindness of expansion that never acknowledged their existence enough to even recognize what was being destroyed, pushing them into smaller and smaller territories until their breeding populations couldn't sustain genetic diversity, until the deep wilderness they needed to survive existed only in fragments too isolated to support viable communities, until they faced the quiet fade of a species dying not with violence, but with the exhausted dignity of ancestors watching everything they'd protected vanish beneath parking lots and housing developments, and the inexorable spread of human certainty. The question that haunted me through those sleepless research nights wasn't whether I could prove their existence, but whether I should, whether bringing them into human awareness would protect or doom them, whether the same species that had destroyed their habitat through ignorance could be trusted with. Knowledge that would make them visible, vulnerable, subject to the machinery of science and government and public curiosity that turned everything rare into either commodity or casualty. The answer to that impossible question revealed itself not through my research, but through further exploration of my grandfather's journals, specifically a leather-bound volume I'd initially overlooked because it wasn't marked with dates or locations like his other field notes. Its pages filled instead with what I'd assumed were abstract sketches and fragmentary observations too personal or too deteriorated to warrant immediate attention. But reading it now with comprehension, sharpened by direct encounter, I recognized the drawings weren't abstractions, but maps, carefully rendered topographies marking specific ridgelines and hollow entrances, each annotated with symbols I'd seen in the stone arrangements outside my cabin, a vocabulary of place and meaning that connected landscape to presence, territory to covenant. The written passages between the maps documented something far more profound than scientific observation, describing encounters that spanned his entire adult life, beginning when he was 17 years old, a young man hunting deer in these same mountains who'd stumbled into a clearing where three of them stood waiting, as if the meeting had been arranged by forces beyond his comprehension, their eyes holding intelligence that shattered everything he'd believed about human uniqueness, about the loneliness of consciousness in a world of beautiful but unreasoning creatures. They hadn't threatened him that day, my grandfather wrote, but they'd shown him something, leading him deeper into wilderness than he'd ever traveled, to a cave system whose entrance was hidden behind a waterfall, its walls covered in markings that predated any indigenous culture he recognized, symbolic language that seemed to document seasons and migrations and astronomical events across time frames, that suggested continuous habitation spanning millennia, proof of sustained culture and memory, and the transmission of knowledge that defined civilization by any honest measure. What emerged from those journal pages was the revelation that my grandfather hadn't simply observed the Dogmen, but had been initiated into a relationship with them, welcomed across a boundary that few humans had ever been permitted to approach, taught, through patient demonstration and symbolic exchange, that they maintained stewardship over certain territories, protecting specific places from human encroachment through methods that worked with natural patterns rather than against them, subtle interventions that made certain valleys feel wrong to loggers, that turned developers away with inexplicable unease, that kept the deepest wilderness zones functioning as refuges, not just for their own kind, but for all species that required true remoteness to survive. The covenant he described wasn't a formal agreement, but an understanding that had developed across generations of his family, beginning with his own grandfather, who'd first made contact in the 1870s, each generation producing one individual who carried the responsibility of maintaining human awareness of the boundary, of ensuring that certain places remained unmolested, of serving as interpreter and intermediary in the few instances when human activity threatened territories the Dogman couldn't abandon. Without catastrophic population consequences, my grandfather had spent 60 years honoring that role, using his reputation as a woodsman and his relationships with local landowners to quietly purchase or protect key parcels, to spread stories that kept people away from sensitive areas, to maintain the conspiracy of silence that allowed the old walkers to persist in a world that had no conceptual space left for their existence. And he'd hoped I might eventually inherit that calling, watching me from my childhood for signs that I carried the particular combination of scientific curiosity and spiritual openness the work required. The final entries in the journal, written in his last months, before the stroke that took his speech, revealed why I'd been drawn back to these mountains, why my career had collapsed precisely when it did, why the fossils had surfaced in my excavation sites with timing that seemed orchestrated rather than accidental. He'd asked them, in whatever wordless communication system they'd developed across decades of contact, to call me home if he died before he could properly pass the covenant forward, to make themselves known to me in ways that would overcome my academic skepticism, to show me what he'd never found the courage to explain during his lifetime because he feared I'd think him delusional or worse, that I'd expose them in pursuit of scientific validation, that I'd inherited his curiosity but not his wisdom about when knowledge should remain unspoken. They'd agreed, he wrote, though their agreement came with grief, because my arrival signaled not just generational transition, but potentially the end of the covenant itself, the last generation who would need human intermediaries, because there might not be enough of them surviving to require protection, their numbers fallen so drastically that the question wasn't whether humans would discover them, but whether they'd exist long enough for discovery to matter, whether this exchange of responsibility marked inheritance or eulogy, the passing of guardianship or the documentation of extinction. I sat with that journal as dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, understanding finally that I hadn't come here seeking redemption for my failed career, but answering a summons that had been arranged before my grandfather's death. That the creature who'd watched me that night hadn't been evaluating a threat, but recognizing family, identifying the one human in whom their survival might find continued advocacy, and that the bone fragments and the footprints and all the carefully orchestrated evidence had been invitation rather than accident, their way of initiating me into knowledge my grandfather had carried alone for too long, preparing me for the role I was being. Us to assume as witness and guardian to beings who'd chosen me long before I'd chosen to see them. The offerings began appearing 3 nights after I'd finished reading my grandfather's journal, arrangements so precisely constructed they transformed my morning walks into gallery visits showcasing intelligence that operated through material, poetry rather than written language. The first I discovered at the forest edge, where the trail opened into meadow, a mandala of sorted bones arranged in concentric circles, each ring representing a different species, deer vertebrae forming the outer boundary, smaller mammal skulls creating inner geometries, and at the absolute center, a single raptor talon pointing true north with astronomical precision that suggested celestial navigation rather than random placement. I photographed it with trembling hands, recognizing immediately that this wasn't territorial marking or feeding behavior, but deliberate communication, a visual sentence constructed for my comprehension. And when I returned, that evening with measurement tools, the arrangement had been modified. The center talon, now accompanied by 3 stones placed at specific intervals that matched exactly the spacing of stars in Orion's belt, a constellation my grandfather's journal had mentioned repeatedly in contexts I hadn't yet deciphered. They were teaching me their grammar, introducing vocabulary through demonstration, assuming I possessed enough intelligence to recognize syntax in spatial relationships, and the implicit respect in that assumption moved me more profoundly than any academic recognition I'd once craved, because they were treating me not as a specimen collector, but as a student capable of learning. Languages that existed before human speech. The second offering appeared on my cabin porch, impossible to miss and equally impossible to explain through conventional animal behavior, a perfectly preserved fox carcass arranged in a posture of rest rather than death, its body positioned on a flat stone, surrounded by carefully sorted plant materials I recognized from ethnobotanical research as traditional preservatives and ceremonial markers. But the detail that stopped my breath was the smaller arrangement beside it, a miniature constellation constructed from seeds and wood fragments that precisely replicated the pattern I'd photographed in the bone mandala, confirming that the repetition was intentional, that they were establishing symbolic consistency across multiple communications, demonstrating that their intelligence operated through systematic representation rather than instinctive response. I sat beside that offering for hours, watching how afternoon light transformed the arrangement, revealing that they'd oriented it to cast specific shadows at certain times, embedding temporal information in spatial design, and I understood with overwhelming clarity that I was witnessing not primitive symbolism, but sophisticated information architecture, communication technology, evolved along completely different vectors, from human writing, yet equally capable of encoding complex meaning, memory, and knowledge transmission. The weight of that recognition crushed something in my chest, grief mixing with wonder, because this level of cultural sophistication meant their extinction wouldn't just be a biological loss, but the erasure of an entire mode of consciousness, a way of knowing and being in the world that had developed across evolutionary timeframes and would vanish without ever being properly understood, taking with it perspectives on existence that humanity would never recover. The third offering shattered my remaining composure entirely, appearing at the fossil site where this journey had begun, arranged directly on the excavation grid where I'd first discovered the anomalous bone fragments that didn't fit established taxonomies. They'd constructed an elaborate temporal diagram using materials that represented different epochs, ancient stones from the fossil layer, arranged in sequence with progressively younger materials, creating a visual timeline that documented their own evolutionary history. In geological grammar, showing divergence points and parallel development and, crucially, convergence moments where their lineage had intersected with early human populations. But the devastating element was the ending they'd constructed. The timeline growing sparser and more fragmentary as it approached the present, materials becoming scarce and scattered until it terminated in a small pile of ash, surrounded by empty space, a visual representation of extinction more eloquent than any population graph I'd ever published, and beside it they'd placed a single item that made my vision blur with tears. One of my grandfather's old field notebooks, taken from the cabin, positioned as a bridge between their ash ending and the empty future beyond, suggesting that human memory and documentation might be all that survives when their physical presence vanishes. I knelt there in the excavation site, understanding that this wasn't just communication, but petition, that they were asking me to do what my grandfather had done, to become memory keeper and guardian, to ensure that when they disappeared, they wouldn't vanish completely, that some record would persist beyond the silence. The offerings continued through the following weeks, growing more complex and emotionally demanding, each arrangement building on previous vocabulary while introducing new concepts, teaching me their cartography of meaning through patient repetition and variation. The terminal reality of their situation revealed itself fully on a rain-heavy evening when I discovered the most devastating offering yet, positioned at the exact center of the clearing where multiple game trails converged, a location my grandfather's journal had identified as sacred, gathering ground for countless generations. They'd constructed what I can only describe as a genetic record, arranged with such sophisticated understanding of hereditary principles that it demonstrated knowledge paralleling human population biology, perhaps exceeding it in intuitive comprehension. A sprawling diagram built from sorted fur samples, showing color variation and texture, organized in family groupings that illustrated bloodline connections across what must have been decades of observation and memory. But the horror lay in what the arrangement documented, the genetic diversity narrowing catastrophically in recent generations, fur samples clustering into fewer and fewer distinct lineages. Evidence of inbreeding depression and population bottleneck made visible through material taxonomy that required no written explanation because the story told itself through diminishing variation, genetic possibility collapsing toward inevitable termination. They'd placed fresh samples at the arrangement's edge, perhaps only 5 or 6. Distinct individuals represented, surrounded by empty space that stretched outward like a void, waiting to claim what little remained. And I understood with nauseating clarity that I wasn't just witnessing cultural extinction, but biological collapse, the final chapters of an evolutionary experiment that had endured for millions of years now. Counting down in single-digit survivors, I spent 3 days analyzing that genetic display, photographing it from every angle while fighting the urge to vomit from overwhelming grief, because the scientific part of my mind that still functioned could calculate exactly what this represented in conservation terms: a population below minimum viable threshold, genetic diversity insufficient for recovery, extinction debt already incurred even if every remaining individual survived. The rain continued falling, and I watched the offering slowly deteriorate, fur matting and colors bleeding together, as if the display itself was demonstrating the dissolution it documented, nature reclaiming the evidence of its own failure and I found myself sobbing in that clearing like I hadn't cried since childhood, mourning not just for them, but for every boundary my species had crossed in arrogant blindness, every threshold we'd violated while congratulating ourselves on progress and dominion. They'd survived ice ages and continental shifts, had navigated millions of years of environmental change and competition, had developed consciousness and culture and sophisticated knowledge systems in evolutionary parallel to humanity. And what finally destroyed them wasn't natural selection or cosmic catastrophe, but strip malls and logging roads and subdivisions, the banal machinery of human expansion that didn't even recognize what it was erasing because we'd convinced ourselves we were the only consciousness that mattered, the only intelligence worth preserving. The full implications crashed over me in waves of escalating horror as I cross-referenced their genetic display with geographical data from my grandfather's journals, mapping the territorial range they'd once commanded against current land use patterns, watching centuries of wilderness compress into isolated fragments too small and disconnected to sustain viable populations. Every protected area was compromised by roads and recreational traffic, every remaining wilderness bordered by development that generated light pollution and noise that disrupted their nocturnal patterns, every corridor they needed for genetic exchange severed by human infrastructure that treated the landscape as empty space awaiting utilization rather than inhabited territory supporting parallel civilization. My grandfather had documented over 30 individuals in his early journals, recording distinct personalities and family groupings and territorial arrangements that suggested robust population structure, but his final entries mentioned only 7, then 5. His handwriting growing shakier as he watched something he'd spent his lifetime protecting circle the drain toward extinction, carrying with it his purpose and meaning, the covenant that had given his life significance dissolving into failure and loss. I was inheriting not just his role, but his grief, the unbearable knowledge of watching consciousness die while possessing neither power nor permission to intervene, bearing witness to tragedy while the rest of humanity remained obliviously complicit in erasure they would never acknowledge because they would never know what had been lost. That night, I returned to the clearing with my own offering, a written pledge constructed with trembling hands, promising to protect what remained for however long they persisted, to guard their existence against discovery and documentation that would transform survivors into specimens, to choose their dwindling future over my vindication or career resurrection. And I buried that promise beneath stones arranged in patterns they'd taught me, speaking vows into darkness that swallowed my words like prayers offered to gods who were themselves dying, hoping desperately that witness and reverence might constitute enough, knowing with crushing certainty that it wouldn't, that I was mourning while the loss was still occurring, watching extinction in slow motion without power to alter its trajectory. The summons came on the winter solstice, the longest night, when I found a trail of carefully placed stones leading from my cabin toward the high ridge my grandfather had called the witnessing place, each marker positioned at intervals that suggested deliberate pacing, an invitation measured in footsteps rather than distance. I followed without hesitation, carrying only the weathered journal and a camera I wasn't certain I'd use, climbing through snow that muffled the world into cathedral silence, each breath hanging visible in moonlight that transformed the forest into something timeless and sacred. The path wound upward through ancient hemlocks whose branches formed natural architecture overhead, and I understood I was walking a route that had been traveled for generations, perhaps centuries, footsteps layered upon footsteps in pilgrimage towards something my species had forgotten how to recognize. The air grew thinner and clearer as I climbed, and with it came a sensation of approaching threshold, of moving from one state of being toward another, the boundary between observer and participant dissolving with each ascending step until I no longer knew which side of that divide I occupied, or whether such distinctions held meaning in this liminal space. They were waiting at the summit, arranged in a semicircle facing eastward toward the coming dawn. 5 figures whose existence rewrote evolutionary history and negated every certainty I'd been taught about consciousness and creation. In the moonlight, they were simultaneously terrifying and heartbreaking, their forms bridging categories my mind struggled to reconcile. Powerful shoulders and elongated muzzles combined with posture and hand structure that spoke of tool use and intention. Eyes that reflected silver intelligence that had nothing to do with animal instinct and everything to do with awareness, choice, sorrow, knowledge. The largest, grizzled and scarred, held my gaze with such profound recognition that I felt my grandfather's presence suddenly vivid between us, understanding without words that this was the same individual he'd known, that I was standing in relationship that predated my birth, inheriting covenant and consequence. Simultaneously, they made no sound, but communication flowed through gesture and stillness, through the way they positioned themselves to include me in their circle, accepting me not as scientist or documentarian, but as witness to transition, as the one chosen to remember what was passing from the world, to carry forward memory that would have no of the vessel. I raised the camera instinctively, then lowered it slowly as understanding crystallized, recognizing that documentation would constitute betrayal, that what they offered existed beyond evidence and proof, that the only way to honor this moment was to experience it fully rather than filter it through lenses that would reduce mystery to specimen. Instead, I sat among them on that frozen ridge, 5 ancient forms and 1 human caught between reverence and grief, watching the sky lighten incrementally as the year's longest darkness surrendered to dawn, and I understood we were performing ritual that had significance beyond individual survival, marking transition and acknowledging, ending with dignity rather than denial. The grizzled elder extended one hand toward me, palm upward, in gesture that transcended species, and I placed my own hand against his, feeling the worn pads and thick claws, the warmth that confirmed mammalian kinship, even as the deliberateness of contact affirmed consciousness that ran parallel to human experience rather than derivative from it. In that touch, I felt the weight of millions of years of separate development, intelligence arising through different evolutionary pressures toward convergent awareness. 2 paths toward consciousness, meeting briefly before one faded forever into memory and myth, and the tragedy of that loss overwhelmed every other sensation until tears froze on my face while dawn broke around us in colors that seemed like farewell. As light spilled across the ridge, they rose as one, and I understood the gathering was complete, that I'd been given what they intended me to receive, not proof but participation, not evidence but experience, the knowledge that I'd been trusted with their reality in its final expression. They moved toward the tree line with impossible grace, pausing at the edge where forest shadow could reclaim them, and the elder turned back once more, holding my gaze with eyes that contained everything I'd spent my life seeking and everything I'd now spend the rest of my life protecting, through chosen silence. Then they were gone, absorbed into wilderness that was itself vanishing, and I remained alone on that ridge carrying the unbearable gift of witness, understanding finally what my grandfather had known, that some truths are too sacred for sharing, that the highest form of knowledge is reverence, that love sometimes manifests as eternal secret-keeping, as choosing to guard fading light against the darkness of forgetting rather than exposing it to scrutiny that would extinguish what little remains. I descended from that ridge, carrying knowledge that rendered my previous career meaningless, every published paper and defended theory reduced to hollow abstraction compared to the living truth I'd experienced in communion with beings the world believed impossible. The university was distant memory, the accusations and professional destruction now seeming like necessary dismantling, preparation for something my credentialed self could never have accepted. the humiliation a kind of ritual purification that stripped away arrogance disguised as empiricism. In the weeks that followed, I compiled my documentation in journals that would never be published, detailed accounts and sketches that captured their existence without betraying their location or vulnerability, creating archive for no audience but myself, testament to what I'd witnessed that would remain, sealed until long after both they and I had vanished from the earth. I developed the photographs from that final night, images of the empty ridge at dawn, deliberately composed to show nothing but landscape, evidence of my choice to honor covenant over career, proof only of restraint and reverence. Some evenings I spread these materials across my cabin floor, rereading my grandfather's journals alongside my own, seeing now how his life had been shaped by the same burden of sacred knowledge, understanding finally why he'd seemed always partially elsewhere, attention divided between the human world and deeper reality he could never adequately explain. The weight of it was crushing and elevating simultaneously, isolation that came from possessing truth I could never share, connection to lineage and purpose that transcended individual ambition, the paradox of feeling simultaneously more alone and more accompanied than ever before in my life. The scientific community moved on without me, my absence barely noted, my theories about convergent intelligence dismissed and forgotten as surely as the beings those theories had unknowingly approached. I took work as a wildlife consultant for conservation organizations, using credentials that still held value in practical contexts, if not academic ones, positioning myself to influence land preservation in regions where I knew the old territories persisted, guardian masquerading as technician, protecting through misdirection and careful silence rather than advocacy that would draw attention. I steered development away from specific valleys and ridge systems, recommended protected corridors through bureaucratic language that concealed true motivation, built buffer zones around sacred geographies using ecological justifications that were factually accurate while strategically incomplete. The work was invisible and incremental, victories measured in acres preserved rather than recognition received, and I found profound satisfaction in this hidden service, in using the tools of my former profession toward purposes those colleagues could never comprehend. Sometimes during field surveys in remote territories, I found signs of their passage, tracks dissolving in morning dew, territorial markings on trees in patterns that spoke of continued presence, even as that presence grew fainter season by season. And these moments sustained me through the frustration and frequent failure of conservation work conducted against relentless human expansion. I was watching them fade in real time, witnessing extinction occurring too gradually for anyone else to perceive, because no one else acknowledged there was anything there to lose. Guardian, attending the drawn-out death of beings the world had already decided into. Non-existence. The question that haunts my sleepless nights is whether my silence constitutes protection or complicity, whether honoring their trust serves their survival or merely preserves my own sense of privileged relationship, whether the world deserves to know what it's losing, even if that knowledge would likely accelerate rather than prevent their extinction. I carry their secret like sacred responsibility and personal torment, understanding that revelation would bring researchers and curiosity seekers flooding into their remaining territories, that proving their existence would guarantee their destruction, yet agonizing over whether collective awareness might somehow generate the political will to preserve the deep wilderness they require. The covenant demands silence, but silence feels increasingly like cowardice disguised as honor, and I live trapped between these contradictions, paralyzed by responsibility too immense for individual judgment. My grandfather's journals offer no resolution to this dilemma, because he died before facing what I now face. The final generation, the last witnesses, the closing of evolutionary possibility that took millions of years to create. On difficult nights, I returned to that ridge where dawn illuminated our gathering, sitting in the exact position I occupied during that solstice ceremony, searching landscape and memory for guidance that never fully arrives, begging the silence itself for wisdom about how to carry this impossible weight forward into whatever time remains. What I know with absolute certainty is this: I have been irreversibly changed, transformed from scientist seeking validation into guardian serving mystery, my ambitions reconfigured around protection rather than recognition, my remaining years dedicated to preserving space for beings whose existence I can never prove and whose extinction I can perhaps only delay rather than prevent. The academic world that rejected me was correct to do so. Not because my theories were wrong, but because I'd approached profound questions with inadequate reverence, seeking to extract and explain rather than honor and protect, treating consciousness as puzzle to solve rather than sacred expression to celebrate. My disgrace was earned through hubris I didn't recognize until humility was forced upon me through failure. The career destruction, a necessary breaking that allowed something truer to emerge from the ruins. I will die carrying secrets that could have restored my reputation, possessing evidence that would vindicate every dismissed theory and scorned hypothesis. And I will take that evidence to my grave, because some truths are too precious for the profane machinery of peer review and academic publication. This is my redemption and my sacrifice. Purpose discovered through ruin, meaning found not in understanding, but in faithful service to what lies beyond understanding, guardian of threshold between worlds that grows narrower each year, witness to magnificence the age of human dominance has no category to contain, keeper of memory for beings who trusted me with their ending, carrying forward their existence in the only way now possible, a story that must remain untold, as knowledge that manifests as protection, as love expressed through eternal silence. What would you sacrifice to protect a truth the world isn't ready to know? Subscribe to witness more encounters at the edge of reality.